The ultimatum was already on the floor when I arrived at my console. I was late by 40 seconds, a malfunction in the corridor seal that forced me 2 levels around. And by the time I pulled my feed interface live, Senior Arbiter Verithsol was already reading the third clause. His voice carried the measured cadence the Commission favored for formal declarations, each sentence weighted and paced for the record, translators. For the 11 delegations arrayed in their tiered positions around the chamber floor. He did not look at the Terran table. The Commission rarely did, when it was winning. I had been assigned to the human delegation's translation feed for 6 months. My function was narrow: monitor the throughput, flag anomalies, log communication events for the Commission's record. The position was considered junior, almost clerical. The Terran delegation had 3 members. They had not raised their voices once in 6 months. There had been very few events to log. I found my output column and checked the session tag. Formal ultimatum, Session 94C. The Commission had spent 11 weeks building to this. The terms were not punitive by the standards of Sorvelian compact law. A reduction of Terran sovereign designation from Class 7 to Class 4, trade exclusion from the inner transit corridors, a mandatory observer status on any future Terran military development. Onerous, yes. Precedent-breaking, arguably. But framed as reasonable. Measured, the product of a body that had studied the Terran file carefully and arrived at considered position. The human at the primary table, Marin Solis, was reading the terms, as Verithsol recited them. She had a physical copy. We always brought physical documents, which had struck the Commission's analysts as affectation in the early sessions, and which I had long since stopped trying to explain to them. She was reading her copy and Verithsol's recitation simultaneously, and her expression was what it always was: level, attentive, without urgency. I watched my feed column. The translation architecture the Commission ran for the Terran delegation was a standard Class 7 deployment, a bandwidth-capped compression layer designed for species whose communicative range fell within established parameters. It had been installed at the start of the session cycle without review. The assumption was that Terran Standard, the diplomatic language the human delegation used in all formal sessions, fell well within Class 7 tolerances. No one had tested this. It was standard practice. The Commission ran Class 7 for every delegation of similar cognitive and linguistic classification, and the Terran file indicated nothing that would require adjustment. Verithsol finished the third clause and moved into the fourth. Solis set her physical copy down. He noted the gesture in my log, not because it was unusual, because she rarely moved during a session unless she was about to speak. She had spoken in 18 of the 93 prior sessions, mostly to ask for clarification on procedural points, twice to request an adjournment, once in session 41, decline an offer that the Commission had expected her to accept. In a single sentence that the Commission's analysts had spent the following week parsing for hidden implications, they had found none. She had meant exactly what she said. Verithsol completed the formal recitation and returned to his seat. The chamber held the particular quiet that follows a delivered ultimatum, the slightly overdone stillness of a body that knows it has been decisive and is waiting for the record to confirm it. Solis looked up. She didn't stand. She didn't reach for her microphone. The chamber used ambient pickup. Standing was not required. What she said seated, with her hands resting flat on the table. In a register I had not logged in 93 sessions. It was not louder. It was not faster. It was something else. A compression, a density, as though the language she was using had more mass per syllable than the Terran standard she had been speaking for 6 months. The feed translation layer, which had been running clean throughout Verithsol's recitation, began producing error flags. I watched them come in. The first flags were benign: bandwidth overrun, realignment request, system catching up to an input shift. Routine. I cleared them and kept my eyes on the output column, waiting for the translation to resolve. It didn't resolve. The flags multiplied. The compression layer was not failing. It was trying to carry something that exceeded its calibration, ceiling, and rather than collapse, it was subdividing the input signal and routing each fragment through separate output channels simultaneously, which was an emergency failsafe behavior. I had read about in the architecture documentation and never seen activate in the field. I had no protocol for this. My function was to flag anomalies and log events. I flagged the anomaly. Then I looked up from my console. The chamber was changing. Celise had not stopped speaking. I could see her. She was still seated, still unhurried, her hands still flat on the table. But the delegations in the lower tiers, the ones whose translation overlays were fed from the same Class 7 architecture I was monitoring, had begun to do something I had never seen during a formal session. They were putting down their earpieces. Not all at once. Not dramatically. The Verith delegation first. Their lead arbiter removed his translation receiver and set it on the table with a quiet deliberateness, then sat forward. Then the Kosovith block, 2 of the 3 members. Then the outer systems observer, who had not been paying particular attention to the session until this moment, and who was now watching the Terran table with the expression "my people" use when something has exceeded the frame we were using to look at it. I had not removed my translation overlay. I was still receiving the feed, such as it was, fragments, error logs, partial reconstructions from the emergency routing. What I was getting was not Solis's words in any language I could parse. It was something the architecture was stitching together from what it could carry, and what it could carry was, evidently, not what she was sending, but I was close enough to hear the room. What I understood, from what reached me through my overlay, the delegations going still around the chamber, from the way Verith Sol's own senior analyst leaned toward him and placed a hand on the table between them without saying anything, was that she was not responding to the ultimatum. She was not refusing it. She was not accepting it. She was describing something. Giving the commission a specific, bounded account of a thing they had not known to consider. Her voice did not rise. It did not carry the cadence of an argument or a counteroffer. It carried the cadence of a record being set straight. She spoke for 4 minutes and 31 seconds. I have the timestamp. When she stopped, she rested her hands flat again and waited. The chamber held a silence that was qualitatively different from the one after Verith Sol's recitation. That silence had been the commission's. This one belonged to no one, and everyone in the room knew it. Verith Sol conferred with his senior analyst in a voice too low to carry. His second arbiter did the same. Around the tiered rows, the 11 delegations were doing various versions of the same thing. Quiet exchanges, checked records, hands held up to pause their own internal feeds. Celise picked up her physical copy of the ultimatum, folded it once along its spine, and placed it on the corner of the table nearest the commission's recording station. The fold was precise. She had done this before with other documents. At the end of sessions, she considered closed. Session log has her speaking for 4 minutes and 31 seconds. In a register, my translation architecture produced 1,142 error flags trying to carry, and then sitting in complete silence for the remaining 2 hours and 14 minutes, while the commission's delegations did not call a recess, did not produce a formal response, and did not return to the terms of the ultimatum. The session closed without a vote. I filed my anomaly report that evening, and in doing so, I was required to review the Commission's baseline documentation for the Terran translation architecture. I had never had reason to look at it before. The baseline had been set at the start of the session cycle, as I said, without species-specific review. What I found, cross-referencing the error log output against the architecture's calibration tables, was that the Class 7 deployment had been running with a throughput ceiling that assumed Terran standard, represented the full communicative range of the Terran delegation. It did not. The calibration tables contained a field I had not known to look for. Registered upper range multiplier, the ratio between the calibrated ceiling and the species' documented communicative capacity. For most delegations, this number was between 0.8 and 1. The translation architecture ran at roughly the species' full range, sometimes slightly below for efficiency. For the Terran delegation, field read, the 0.1. The Commission's translation architecture for 6 months had been carrying 12% of what Marin Solis was capable of sending. I sat with that number for a long time. The architecture had not been malicious. It had not been set deliberately. It had been set by an intake system that matched Terran's standard to the closest classification in its database. found a reasonable analog, applied the standard sealing, and moved on. The intake system was not designed to question its own analogs. No one had asked it to. For 6 months, the Commission had been reading its transcripts, analyzing its records, building its position, and constructing its ultimatum. All of it based on a picture of the Terran delegation assembled from 12% of their signal. They had arrived at what they considered a thorough, calibrated, evidence-based assessment. They had been very confident in it. I submitted my anomaly report at the 18th hour after the session. I included the calibration finding as a technical appendix, flagged at standard priority, because I did not know how else to classify it. The Commission's technical office returned a response in less than 3 hours. The reclassification order came down 4 hours after that. Well inside the 48-hour ultimatum window, though the window was not mentioned, the Terran delegation's translation architecture was to be suspended, pending a full species-specific calibration review. All transcripts from sessions 1 through 93 were flagged for re-evaluation. Session 94C was to remain in the record, closed as filed. I learned later that Verath Sol had requested a private adjournment with the Terran delegation the following morning. I was not told what was discussed. My translation function for the delegation was suspended during the review period, so I have no log to reference. What I know is that Solis attended that meeting, and that the Commission's formal response to the meeting appeared in the procedural record. 3 days later, withdrew the terms of the ultimatum, pending the calibration review's outcome. The review took 7 weeks. I was not assigned to it. What I was assigned to, when the new translation architecture came online, was the recalibration session, a controlled intake where each member of the Terran delegation spoke a standard phrase set in their full range while the new system mapped its ceiling. It was a technical procedure, routine in theory. The technician running the calibration had done this for 63 species. She stopped the intake twice to check her equipment. She completed it without comment, filed the results, and submitted a recommendation that the Commission's standard intake protocol be revised to include a minimum range verification step before any new delegation's architecture was deployed. The recommendation was approved within 2 weeks. The Commission's intake protocol, as of the date of that revision, has included that step for every delegation since. I have thought often about what the Commission concluded in those 11 weeks of deliberation. What they studied, what they weighed, how confident they were. Verath Sol is a careful arbiter, methodical, thorough, not given to overreach. The other senior members are the same. They had done the work. They had read the transcripts. They had built a picture of the delegation across the table from them, and they had trusted it, because it was assembled from 6 months of careful observation, and because nothing in the sessions had given them reason to question the quality of their record. 12% of the signal is still a signal. It was coherent. It was consistent. It behaved in 6 months of diplomatic sessions, exactly as the Commission had learned to expect it to behave. Solis had been speaking slowly for us. I don't know if she knew. I don't know how clearly she understood. Coming into session 94C with that folded physical copy of the ultimatum, what the Commission's architecture had been doing with her words for half a year. I don't know if she shifted registers deliberately, or because the moment required it, because the 12% had finally become insufficient to carry what she needed to say. What I know is that she came into that chamber, received an ultimatum built on a fraction of the record, and responded, not by refusing, not by arguing, not by walking out, but by speaking plainly in her full register for 4 minutes and 31 seconds. The Commissions did not vote. The window closed without a reply from the Terran delegation. No reply was required because the ultimatum had been formally withdrawn. That is what the record says. The record is accurate. It just doesn't say everything.